In a world where cars start to look glaringly similar, there are some brands that try their best to stand out. Bold design is what defines them, and that is certainly the case for Peugeot. Now back here in Malaysia, under Stellantis, their first model launch is this, the 408. With us is the 408 GT, the top spec model pushing 200,000 ringgit. And the question we're asking now is it worth the money? My name is Ayman Abdullah. This is Malaysian Motoring. This is our review of the 2024 Peugeot 408 GT. Now, before we get into this car's looks, we first have to touch on the basics. So up front, regardless of which variant you go for, you get the same 1.6 litre PureTech turbocharged 4-cylinder engine with power going to the front wheels via an 8-speed automatic ISIN gearbox. Now, it is worth noting that this particular engine is a multi-award winner across the globe, known not only for its fuel efficiency, but also for its performance and durability. The gearbox, however, is new for our market. We have not yet seen a Peugeot running this new 8-speed, and so that does throw some questions into the air, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, talking about the design, this is obviously the GT model, the full spec flagship version, which is why we get a lot of very nice bits and pieces up front. So for example, on the GT line model up front, you get a lot more body colored panels, as well as this gorgeous Peugeot grille that bleeds into these LED headlights. Now, for the Allure and Premium models, these are just LEDs, but on this GT, these are matrix LED headlights, or what they refer to as Peugeot Matrix technology. Now, ultimately, these are active high beam systems, similar to what we've seen before from Mercedes-Benz and Volvo, etc. But these are, again, a cut above the rest within the C segment. Now, this panel here works not only as a daytime running light as well as the positioning lights, but also the indicators. Now, I will note, however, that I do take issue with the fact this LED light doesn't come all the way to the top of the headlights, because I think that would have made it look a little bit more distinctive. Now, down the side, again, because this is a GT, it runs on 20-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Goodyear Eagle F1 tires. There are smaller wheel sizes available as you move further down the lineup. Now, because this is a 408, it does mean that it does cut a slightly different look compared to other C-segment vehicles. Now, Peugeot builds this as an SUV coupe crossover thing, which means that to them, there are no direct competitors. However, within this segment, this car would be going head-to-head with vehicles like the Toyota Corolla as well as the Honda Civic. Now, in spite of that, this car does ride a little bit higher, which is why, as you can see, it does have significantly higher ground clearance compared to those vehicles, but it does also have this very dramatic roofline. Now, I will also point out the fact this car has very flared wheel arches at the rear, which means that when you're sat in the cabin and you look out through the rear view mirror, you can always see these haunches sitting behind you, and that does provide a little bit of visual excitement. Now, one of the things on this car that I don't particularly like is the fact that while the mirror caps as well as the trim around the windows are done up in black, so are the door handles. Now, this to me is a very strange choice because it just makes it look like it's unpainted. Now, that dramatic roofline does lead into this very interesting looking tail. It's been compared to vehicles like the Lamborghini Urus for some reason, although I don't quite see it. Although maybe if you stare long enough at this interesting sort of rear spoiler arrangement, maybe you'll get a little bit more of that. Now, the taillights on this car are also full LED, at least they are up here. Now, there are two different taillight signatures. For the 408 GT, you get this sort of dash design, whereas in the Allure and Premium, they are straight, so that's another way to tell this car apart at night. At the rear, you will find a lot of this unpainted black plastic, again to give it those crossover vibes, and of course your reverse lights and rear fog lights live down there, which are just bulb, although apparently they are efficient enough. Now, one of the benefits of having this sloping roofline is that you end up with a lift back, which means that this car's relatively large boot space is much more easily accessed, so you can very easily reach in all the way to the furthest edges of the boot. Now, in terms of the size, this is a pretty decent amount. It is a little bit bigger than what you get from the Honda Civic as well as the Toyota Corolla. And of course, you can expand this further by folding the rear seat 60-40 or using the central pass-through if you just have long, thin items. Now on this, I would like to point out a couple of things. There is no space underneath the boot floor because in this GT model, it's taken up by a subwoofer and there is no visible spare wheel. On top of that, the load lip in here is also unusually high, and there is also a significant amount of overhang, which means that you have to actually carry things over this part of the bodywork as not to scuff up this bit of plastic. And because this is plastic and not painted, you can't buff it out if you scratch it. Now, it is worth pointing out that at least there are these sort of aluminium scuff plates here, but even on this car, which has done about 1,200, 1,400 kilometers, it's already pretty scratched up, no doubt from other motoring journalists taking things in and out of the boot, and so, yeah, that doesn't bode well. At least it's powered though, which is nice. Assuming it doesn't clip me. Oh, there's also a hands-free tailgate thing if you... Here. Now inside, the 408 continues that design flair with a design that we've seen before from Peugeot, in the sense that you have a small instrument binnacle that sits on top of the small steering wheel, as well as a continuation of the iCockpit display here in the middle. But overall, this interior does look quite interesting. You now have ambient lighting here, you've even got some of this microfiber material up here on the door, and the material quality in the front does seem pretty good. Build quality is also pretty good. You don't have a lot of moving, a lot of rattling, and there is plenty of cubby spaces dotted about the place. We've got a big center armrest here with a USB port. You get a cubby hole here, a couple of cup holders here, big enough to hold a large bottle like this, 12-volt socket, USB-C port, another pocket up here, as well as a separate wireless charger on the upper tier. But beyond that, the biggest factor in this car is actually the technology, because it is displayed very nicely indeed. We've seen this before from Peugeot and they have evolved it further with this new generation 408. So this display now is split into two panels, where this bottom is called the i-toggle display and this part up here is referred to as the i-cockpit. Now this display up here is not only incredibly sharp and also very responsive, but it's also just really lovely to use with great animations, and everything works very smoothly. On top of that, there's even an animation to show where your finger is going and kind of how the car is reacting to it, so you always know what your inputs look like. Now underneath that, you get the i-toggle display. This is exclusive to the 408 GT, and these are a set of configurable panels where you can set whatever setting or whatever shortcut you'd like in here. Now when I first got this car, I thought that these were just limited to whatever options you find on the home screen, but as it turns out, you can even add shortcuts into this from various setting pages within the car itself. So as a result, I've even got the panoramic camera available here at all times, as well as my Android Auto, climate and seat options. Now talking about the climate, this car misled me to think that this i-toggle display works for climate control settings. They don't. Even if you were to put your various sort of zone settings in here, you can't actually adjust any of the temperature settings or even the fan speed through this. Instead, you are limited only to a climate auto button, which allows you to set between soft, medium and hard fan speed, as well as a climate shortcut, which brings up the climate menu itself. Now, it's only through this climate menu that you can adjust the temperature. Now, I find this especially irritating because not only are the graphics a little bit slow there in terms of the responsiveness and so on, so it's quite difficult for you to have to set your climate control settings quickly if you're trying to do that when you're driving. But if you have Android Auto open, that takes up this entire upper screen and then you can't control your climates whatsoever. Not if you swipe down from the top, not even if you try to swipe from the bottom, you just don't have access. You just have to press the climate button and move into a separate climate menu and then go back to Android Auto, which just isn't all that nice. Now, that aside, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay is available wirelessly, and it does take up the entirety of the screen, and it does look pretty good as well, again thanks to that high refresh rate and high pixel density, which is all very nice. Now beyond that, there is obviously the iCockpit display instrument cluster itself, which in this car also comes with a 3D functionality. Now the way that works is there is a screen on the top that reflects over a reflective surface that is set ahead of the digital meter cluster that sits behind it. Now what Peugeot says is this allows the car to show the more pertinent and important information on the display that's closer visually to the driver, and so it's easier for them to pick up any important information that they need to know about right now. Whereas other things that might be less important, like say your fuel or your economy or your distance to empty or your oil temperature, all of that sits further back, so your eyes only focus on the information that is closest to the driver. Now, while that's all good in theory, in reality it just feels nice to look at, but doesn't really serve much in terms of functionality. This is very typical of Peugeot, to do something differently for the sake of it. It is a spirit of innovation that we've seen before from this brand, but it remains to be seen if this actually serves any practical purpose. On top of that, there is some duplicity within this panel, because I have noticed that if I turn on my indicator, there is actually an indicator symbol that comes up on the instrument cluster and then one more that comes up next to it. Okay. Now beyond that, we also have this tiny little steering wheel. This is very, very reminiscent of Peugeots that we've driven in the past, like the 2008, 3008 and 508, and even older Peugeots like the 508 and 308. And this is rather nice to hold. Good materials, nice leather, great stitching, and because it's so small, it's very easy for you to maneuver the car through tight spaces. It makes the car feel a lot more nimble than it is. You get paddle shifters on the back to manipulate the gearbox, as well as an array of buttons on the front to control things like your adaptive cruise control, as well as your entertainment functionalities. Now, in order to control your trip, etc., you use buttons at the ends of the stalks, and I must admit that these do feel quite nice to use and quite nice to hold. And once you're aware of where they are, it's very easy to manipulate the screen to show you the information that you want. Now, in terms of that information, you can actually get it to show you a variety of different things. There are various views available, all accessible via just touching this button on this side, which allows you to show things like your information. It shows you your navigation. You can show a full map, as well as your instant consumption, etc., as well as your ADAS functionality, all available through this screen, which is nice because at least that info is where you want it. Now, beyond that, in terms of comfort, for the 408 GT, both of these front seats are powered, replete with massage functionality for the backrest. And I will admit that this is one of the better massage functions we've seen in cars lately. On top of that, you get memory functionality for the driver for 2 settings. And this steering wheel is also infinitely adjustable, almost infinitely adjustable, so it's very easy for you to get a good driving position. However, I will point out the fact that because you have to set this steering wheel below the instrument cluster, it does mean that clearance between your thigh and your steering wheel can be a bit tight, and it is a little bit more complicated to find a comfortable driving position in this car as a result. So please test drive a new Peugeot before you commit to buying, because these things are quite important. I do appreciate, however, that there is adjustable lower thigh support, which means that it is quite easy to get comfortable in this car, and you can do many, many miles in this without feeling too fatigued. Now, because of that crossover-like body style, it is very easy to get in and out of the 408. And once you're in the back, you realize that there is actually a pretty decent amount of space, not just because this car has a long wheelbase, but also because of intelligent design. The back rest of the front seats is actually scalloped in order to maximize knee room. And so at 170 centimeters, I have a pretty good amount of space. And I can also tuck my feet in underneath the seats in front of me, which means that I do have decent under-thigh support. The only trouble is headroom is a bit tight, even for me, which means that if you do have taller passengers or potentially taller children, then that might be a problem. On top of that, the ISOFIX mounts in this car live behind these incredibly tight zippers, which makes it very difficult to access them at the best of times. And because of the way the front seats are sculpted, it does mean that a rear-facing child seat might be a little bit more challenging to get in this car, also not aided by the fact that these doors do not open as wide as you might necessarily expect. Now, aside from that, I do have a center armrest here with a couple of cup holders. I get 2 USB-C ports, a set of crotch coolers, and overall life back here isn't so bad until you start looking at the details. Because, for example, while the material quality in the front, especially on the door cards, was quite nice, in the back, yeah, this is particularly unforgiving plastic. You do still at least get that lovely microfiber suede material, but then further down you get more of that nasty plastic. Even the panel for the window controls in the back half of the car is different from the ones in the front. And again, this is a harder wearing, but also less pliant material. And it just feels like corners have been cut in order to get this car at this price point. And at 200,000 ringgit, it's not exactly affordable either. That said, however, a lot has been said about how Peugeots drive, and Stellantis is very proud of the fact the 408 is apparently designed to engage drivers. So, the thing about Peugeots is that there's always been something said about how they drive. There is a sense of connectedness from behind the wheel, which is something that they aim to emphasize and improve upon by, with a small steering wheel, the overall iCockpit architecture. Now, firstly, I'd like to apologize for my appearance because the weather has been our biggest enemy today, which is why my hair naturally got wet and I looked especially gross, but here we are. Now, the thing about the 408 is this is supposed to be a C-segment contender, which means that driving dynamics is pretty high on the importance list. That's because cars like the Honda Civic and the Toyota Corolla, especially in GR Sport guys, drive particularly well. And so it becomes important then that these cars have a certain dynamic edge to them. So in terms of the 408, well, a few things stand out immediately. Firstly is this gearbox, because it is quite responsive and quite snappy, and it will give you the gears that you want broadly when you want them. And of course, when it's being a little bit recalcitrant, of course, you do have access to the flappy paddles, and so you can change the gears and get just the right ratio that you want. And they are quite responsive through the paddles themselves. Beyond that, of course, you also have this engine. Now, the 1.6 PureTech engine has been in Malaysia for quite some time now. We're very familiar with its characteristics and its character altogether. And so it's certainly a very positive place to be. It's nice to come back to this PureTech engine after however long it's been. Now, this engine is relatively responsive and you do not get much in terms of turbo lag. The fact that it's a relatively small engine with a relatively small turbocharger, and because the gearbox is as responsive as it is, it ensures that the engine speed is always right where the turbo needs it to be in order to be most effective. And even when you're driving around in normal mode, the way this car picks up and goes is quite remarkable. It does kind of hike up its skirt and get going, which is always nice to see, especially in a vehicle that isn't really that big. You want to be able to shuffle this car around, you want to be able to enjoy the dynamics, and you don't want the powertrain to be the weakest link in this overall recipe. And then there's the steering. So obviously we're in the GT model, which runs on 20-inch alloy wheels, and so it does mean that there is very little in terms of tire wall flex when you do want to shift this car around a bit. And that does provide a degree of immediacy through the steering wheel, because it does feel like whatever inputs I make are translated to the road very, very quickly indeed. And while that's certainly very positive, the rest of it is a little bit of a mixed bag. So on the one hand, you have this car's ride, which is incredibly well judged. At no point does it feel overly harsh, but it also never feels like it's too soft. Peugeots have had very good suspension for quite some time. Even this car benefits from the single oscillation dampers that Peugeot has been quite famous for. And so it does mean that body control is very well managed, while never feeling too crashy over the worst bumps. That said, the 20-inch alloy wheels do transmit some of that harshness into the cabin when you first hit particularly bad potholes, but these are very minor niggles and they don't happen that often. Even though I live in PJ, it doesn't really get into my way most of the time, and so I guess it isn't really that big of a problem. It just depends on what your perspective on the matter is. But in terms of the dynamics itself, it just feels like this car isn't as communicative as I would like it to be. Now, I have enjoyed Peugeots previously, cars like the 2008, 3008, 508, and again, the older 508 and 308. Those cars were all very good to drive, within context. I mean, SUVs obviously are not going to drive as good as hatchbacks and vice versa, but for what they were, they drove very well. So for the 408, firstly, we have to decide whether or not this is a saloon or potentially a station wagon. But to me, this car deserves to be evaluated primarily as a saloon because its majority competitors are saloons. And so with that in mind, this car doesn't quite have the same sort of dynamic grace that we enjoyed from the Honda Civic, at least from the few test drives I've been able to eke out from sales advisors, where that car is very communicative to the driver, and so you're always very aware of where the limits are and just how far left you have to go. In this, it feels a little bit more numb. Now, on the one hand, that does improve refinement, and so it makes you feel like you're in a much plusher, much posher car. But on the other hand, it also means that this is just not that dynamically engaging. This isn't a car that sort of ekes you to drive faster and to find the limits of the road and find the limits of your abilities. Instead, this is a sort of car that tells you that, yes, we can do that, but maybe you shouldn't. So it's polite, I guess. That's one way to describe it. It's very competent and it's very capable, but at no point is it very eager. And so it just doesn't make you want to drive this car all that enthusiastically. And so once you put enthusiastic driving to one side, when you drive this like a sensible, normal human being, there are plenty of plus points in this car to enjoy. For example, the refinement at higher speed in this car is very commendable. Even with the 20-inch alloy wheels and the wide profile tires, when you're driving along at about 110, 120 kilometers an hour, the amount of road and wind noise that gets into the car is impressively suppressed. This is despite this car running on Goodyear Eagle F1 tires, which are not exactly known for being particularly comfortable. And on top of that, because these seats are so ergonomically designed, it just means that you sink into them and just enjoy every mile that you have to cover. It just means that what this car does, instead of engage the driver, is relax them, which is not really what the exterior design especially would have been informing me, but there we are. As it turns out, the 408 GT is really a GT. It's about touring, it's about taking in distance, in comfort and style and safety. On that note, it is a little bit bittersweet because although this 408 GT comes chock full of everything that Peugeot can throw at it, including adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, blind spot monitoring, 360-degree camera, lane keep assist, lane centering assist, etc., it's just a shame that you have to buy the 408 GT in order to enjoy these features. The level 2 semi-autonomy systems are not available in the Premium or the Allure, which is really quite irritating, because there are a lot of parts of this car that work very well at a lower price point. And so if this car had the full gamut of active safety features for significantly less money, then this would be a much easier car to recommend. But as it stands, it is a little bit of a challenge. I say that not because this car is overly expensive. I think for 200,000 ringgit, given the features on offer, as well as the certain nice-to-have things like the big alloy wheels and the GT line trim, etc., I do think that it is a pretty decently priced package, although it's certainly not on the affordable end of the scale. It's just that for 200,000 ringgit, there are lots and lots of options out there. For a little bit more, for example, you could get into something like a BMW 218 Grand Coupe. And for a little bit less, you could get into a Tesla Model 3 or a BYD Seal. In fact, for the same money, you could get into a BYD Seal Performance. And that's a car with significantly more legroom, headroom, and overall practicality, while also being significantly more powerful. So it does sort of beg the question, what is it that you're getting with this car that truly sets it apart? So firstly, there is the fact this car is incredibly boldly designed. There is nothing else on the road that looks like this. And admittedly, driving this car around for the last week or so, it has turned heads everywhere I have gone. This car is very much avant-garde design, the way you would expect to see, again, from Peugeot. But beyond that, as a C-segment saloon like so many others, sure, the boot is perhaps slightly more practical, and maybe the slightly increased ride height means that you'll be less concerned when you're driving over speed bumps. But beyond that, I just don't see the overall appeal. I know that there are plenty of buyers out there, some of which have reached out to us to let us know that they've bought a 408 GT. And one of the primary reasons they bought one is simply because of the way this car presents itself. Both the exterior and interior design are truly different from anything else out there, and I suppose for some people that is good enough. And so if you're swayed by this appeal to look and appear different, to be truly bold and out there, then I've no doubt that anything I tell you about this car will make no difference whatsoever. You are going to buy one because you like it, and I completely understand that point of view. It's just that if you're looking for potentially the best car within the segment to drive, then the Toyota Corolla GR Sport is arguably the better balance between dynamics and handling. Is potentially the better balance between dynamics and comfort. If you'd like to go further out there, of course, there is the Honda Civic, which in RS, guys, is a pretty decent steer. But I think for the 408, it is very much a matter of fortune favoring the bold. Those who are out there who are willing to take a chance on something that looks truly different, who do not mind standing out the furthest 180 degree from a wallflower, you will like cars like these. I understand the appeal, and to be fair, it's also getting under my skin. It's just those little practical considerations that need to be taken into account. But in any case, that has been our review of the Peugeot 408 GT. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can join our new WhatsApp channel. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.